really cool to be here and really appreciate Vince inviting me. So, managing partner of Robinson Fransman. We're a law firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I think you know Mr. Nick Moore.
I don't know how you deal with that guy.
Quite well. Well, I don't. No, he's my law partner, actually. I know, because I heard your name and I just texted him. I was like, wait, don't we work with Lee?
Yeah, Nick's my guy. He does all my
Yeah. So that's cool. So, commercial finance and investment lawyer, basically. And so, to Vince's point, I also have close to 500 doors myself as an investor in multifamily, both as limited partners and as general partners. And so we're going to talk about raising capital for deals through syndications. I need to get a new picture. This was a long time ago. I know, right? This is like right when I graduated law school. I just told my secretary that day, I was like, can you please update this for me? And the services we provide at the firm, security services, real estate services, we're really soup to nuts. So from LOI execution all the way through documents, delivery, title, survey, and closing. So we represent our clients in the acquisition, so preparing purchase and sale agreements, even on the disposition side, selling those properties, and then quarterbacking the lender's closing checklist. When you get into larger, bigger deals, that becomes a nightmare in and of itself, right? Just pushing paper around, getting the lenders what they need. But it's important, obviously. And then we handle the capital raise. So that's what we're going to talk about mainly today. And how do you actually buy these properties, right, with other people's money, with passive investors, right? How do you do that? And then we manage, if we can get our hands on it, we manage the title and the closing process as well, all the way from beginning to end. So we find that it's really, it's a soup to nuts type of service, and it's just, there's less cooks in the kitchen. You're not having to hire a transactional lawyer and then a finance lawyer and an SEC lawyer. It's all sort of under one roof. So I am a lawyer, so here's the disclaimer, right? This is no legal advice here. So what is, I just gave the answer away. What is the first rule of real estate investing? Huh? Use a bank? Yeah. Okay. What else?
Location.
That's a good one. Can anyone think? What's the first way? We're all here to learn how to invest in real estate. What's the first rule?
Other people's money.
Yeah. Well, that's it. So, people always say don't lose investors' money. And I said, well, that's 1B, I would say. 1A, I think, is use other people's money. And to your point, that could be anybody, right? That could be banks, right? It could be sellers, creative financing, seller financing, friends and family. So most people start out asking their uncles and their cousins and their friends, hey, I'm going to buy some real estate. Why don't you invest $50,000 in my deal, right? And then institutional investors, once you start growing and scaling, getting that track record you talked about earlier. And then even strangers in some circumstances, right? How do you get money from strangers, right? How do you do that legally, right? You're not going to go on the street and ask somebody for some money. But if you've got a big enough track record and you're Blackstone, people give money to Blackstone. They don't know Steve Schwartzman, right? They don't know anybody there. But they're doing it because of that track record that they have and the institutional just sort of prowess of being a Blackstone. So what do we need this money for, right? What are we doing with this money? We're gonna buy the property. But there's lots of other things that we need the cash for, and this all comes into your sources and uses. I'm sure you'll get into some more tactical information today, but the sources of where the money's coming from banks, coming from equity, and then what's the uses of the money? These are all uses, right? So you've got your down payment, you got your closing costs you got to pay for, operating capital reserves. Are you going to make any CapEx, right? A lot of value-add properties require some capital improvement to increase the value, right? So if you can increase this. You can update this kitchen and renovate this unit, and you were charging $1,000 a month, and now after you renovate, you're going to charge $1,300 a month. But it costs you maybe $3,000 to upgrade the unit. Is that worth it? Right? You got to go through your financial modeling to make sure that those costs make sense. Your financing costs, you're going to pay your lenders and your brokers and whatnot. And then your acquisition fees. We'll talk about this, but as sponsors, aspiring sponsors, you charge your investors acquisition fees, right? So you get to include that in the capital, right? So the LPs essentially are giving you money to pay you for your services of acquiring the property, putting it under contract, working with the brokers, doing the whole thing. It takes 3 months to close. And so most people do this through a syndication. And I heard someone talk about they were in some couple joint ventures a little while ago. And there's a big difference between joint ventures and syndications, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the way that you use other people's money passively, passive investors, is through what's called a syndication. A syndication is, it's actually, the U.S. Supreme Court defined what an investment contract is in 1947 in a U.S. Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Howey. And they basically said if you were organizing a group for a common purpose to promote a common interest and carry out a particular business, right? That's definitely the definition of a partnership. And this partnership that we're talking about is between investors and a manager. So the investors are passive, they're putting in the cash. The manager is managing the property. Now, not necessarily, managing the boots on the ground, collecting the rent, paying the bills. That's one type of management. But also managing the asset, right? The company management. Managing the relationships, managing the investors, managing the property manager. Oftentimes you have to do that. The sponsor in that instance is the manager, and they're kind of the syndicator of the deal who's responsible for finding it, underwriting it. The investors put in the capital. And I post this quite a bit on my social media. I'll say, like, what's more important? Like, is it the investors or the sponsor? What do you guys think? Is it the boots on the ground who's running the deal and improving the property and executing the business plan? Or is it the money that comes in and makes you're available to even buy the property? The money people always think they're the most important, right? The operators, the sponsors always think they're the most important, but it's a symbiotic relationship, right? You have to have both in order to get a deal closed. So we in groups like this, and I want to come back to, I forgot your name, Marka, right? You were like, track record. How do I get a track record, right? Well, partner with people like Lee. Partner with other experienced sponsors, right? Get in on these GP teams, and if you don't have money, you've got hustle. And you've got connections, right? So there's lots of ways to add value to a GP team, even though you may not have any money, right? But maybe you've got time to underwrite and bird dog deals and find opportunities, right? Partner with more experienced investors. That's how all new aspiring syndicators get their first deal and get in the door, right? And then at the same time, start developing your network, right? You've heard of this, the more hands you shake, the more money you make, right? Your network is your net worth. I hate this little cliche thing, but they're so true, right? They're absolutely true. So the more meetings you go like this, the more people you meet, your network will just grow. And so we sometimes when we have lots of GPs in a deal, because a lot of newer sponsors, they'll have 5, 6, 7 GPs in a deal. I heard Lisa earlier, make sure you vet your partners, right? Very important. Don't get into bed with someone that you haven't vetted quite a bit. We enter into co-sponsorship agreements that kind of memorializes who's doing what, right? Okay, one person's going to raise the capital, one person's handling the bank, one person's handling the broker, one person is asset managing, one person's doing the due diligence on the property, and then so we talk. Well, I'll mention this quite, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But the difference between a joint venture and syndication. Does anyone know that off the top of their head? What do you think? No? Go ahead.
Isn't a joint venture like just with two people, where like a syndication is like a structure with multiple investors and operating agreements and all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, similar. Go ahead.
Well, the syndications when you have more investors, or a joint venture, you just have a few investors, and it's more you share everything. Where a syndication also you have investors, and it's just more structured, and it's more like an investment, but more like
Close. Yeah.
A syndication is you're selling a security.
Right.
A JV is, it's just a partnership. You're in it with your own money. You're not taking out people's capital.
Right. Yep. Go ahead.
A joint venture is where everybody in the joint venture has a role in operating the business, and you can lose all of your money or even more than all of your money because you are just in it for the complete life
Yeah.
of the property. Whereas with the syndication, you can only lose as much as you put into it, which
Yeah, I would. You're a little off track with the losing money point, but you were spot on about the activity level. So the definition of a joint venture versus syndication turns on the activity level of the partners. And to take your example, if you have 5 people, and one person says, "I'm the manager of this property," and he gets $400,000 from the other 4 people, and they say, look, you just run the property, just give us our preferred returns, we're let us know when the thing sells. It's only 5. Is that a syndication or a joint venture? Right? That's a syndication, right? A syndication is if you're taking someone's money and and they're expecting a rate of return and a profit based on your efforts as the promoter, it is a syndication. So it doesn't matter how many people. I had a conversation last night with somebody who was like, well, it's just, he was going down this rabbit hole of hypotheticals. What if it's my mom? It's just $10,000. Is that a syndication? It's like, look, man, the SEC doesn't give us the tea leaves, and yes, it is. If you're taking her money and you're going to go invest it. Now there's a different question of what's your level of risk tolerance, right? Is your mom going to sue you? Probably not, right? So, okay, take her money, go invest it, and you'll probably be fine. But the issue is whether it's a joint venture syndication turns on whether you are going, the activity level of the individual members of the company. So here's a simple version. We're going back to syndications. Most investors and sponsors and aspiring syndicators, they start out with a very simple deal, right? We've got our investment LLC. This is the LLC that's going to purchase the property. We've got our manager LLC here. This is the entity that's going to receive cash distributions and fees. This is where the sponsors are located, right? And again, you want to do this for also, really for limited liability, right? These are LLC companies, so there's no personal responsibility or liability of the individual sponsors if anything goes wrong. But the sponsors do have to have enough liquidity and net worth. It's another reason why you partner with people, because if you're going to get a $10 million property, guess what? You have to have a net worth of at least $10 million. You have to have liquidity of at least 10% of that, which is $100,000 in your bank, right? Now, lenders will look at it as a whole. They won't look at each individual member of the GP. They'll say, okay, there's 6 of them. They all collectively are about $10 million of net worth. But that's where the manager and the sponsors will sit. The investors, they purchase interest, right? They receive actual membership interests in this company. So these are not loans, very important distinction. They're actually members of this company, right? So this is we call them Class A membership units in the investment LLC, right? Now they're passive. So the shares that the investors have are passive investment shares here. The active shares are these shares, right? That's what makes it a passive investment opportunity. So most investors start here. When you get into bigger deals, you'll kind of look like this. I was going to give this distinction, but this is a deal I structured. It was a 1,000-unit portfolio in Texas. And what's interesting about this, talk about taking down partnerships and bringing down big deals. There was 3 properties, huge deal. These were Wall Street like pref groups, right? Preferred equity groups. But then there was 3 separate investment groups that had each had their own set of investors, and they didn't want each other. They didn't want to know about each other. So I had to structure them over here. Right? I had this was a syndication, this was a syndication, and this was a syndication. And so all 3 of them came through here, and then we owned the property this way. It was very complicated. It was very complicated. So just think, we start here. As you grow, you get that track record, you get your feet wet. You'll end up taking down big deals like this, right? That's the goal. So who are the members of the company? We talked a little bit about Class A and Class B members. We want the investors to feel more important, so we give them the Class A title because it's before B, right? And so they are the limited partners that subscribe to the membership interests. They sign actual subscription agreements. So when you're doing a syndication, the investors will sign the operating agreement because they become members of the company. They sign a subscription agreement. The subscription agreement is essentially like the purchase contract for the securities. And the operating agreement acts as their actual, it reflects their ownership in the actual company. Very importantly, though, they have no voting or management control. They typically own a larger proportion of the share, right? I mean, the idea here is you're using other people's money, right? So you're going to give the investor a larger proportion of the equity because you're not putting any money in, right? You're finding the deal, you're going to get what's called a promote at the end of the day. You're going to get a share, but usually the investors will get a larger share. And there's ways to structure those economics so that the incentives are aligned, meaning the more money the investor gets, the bigger share the GP gets. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. The Class B members, those are the individual sponsors. They do have actual voting rights. They own typically 25 to 40%, and it's held through another company. We talked about it earlier about the management level entity. A typical deal, an investor is offered, your investment is going to be offered a preferred return. And what does that mean? So it's preferred in that the investors get paid before you get paid as a GP or as a sponsor, right? Typically 6 to 10%. I've got a deal. I own 2 assisted living facilities as well, and we're paying an 11% preferred return because these things are cash cows, these personal care homes, right? So 6% is typically your newer product, Class A, stabilized assets, right? I would say the vanilla type deal is an 8% pref and what we call a 70-30 split, which means the investors get 70% of the profits and the sponsor gets 30% of the profits. And that's, you may go over this a little bit later in the day, but there's a myriad of ways to structure that, right? You could do 80-20, you could do 60-40, you could do a 70, you could do an 8% pref up to a 70-30, but then guess what? Once they get to 8, then it goes 60-40, right? So the GP gets more money, right? Then once it goes to 12, you can go 50-50, right? So those IRR hurdles are a good way to structure, to make sure your incentives are aligned with your investors. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Do you guys, is your company able to, you talked about bypassing a lot of the other lawyers and this and that. Does your company take care of, in other words, if I find a deal and I'm trying to structure the percentages, is that what you guys do?
Absolutely.
Where I can call you and say, hey, Todd, can you help me to structure this?
Yeah, and that's where coming, kind of piggybacking on Vince's arm, because I know how to invest myself and I have my own deals, I can certainly consult with you on your financial modeling and go through what makes sense from an economic perspective. Yeah, absolutely. Because again, you want to, to invest in real estate, especially in this game, it's as soon as you learn the modeling, the financial modeling, it's just you're plugging in numbers, right? It's a math exercise. Right, you plug in your purchase price, you plug in your equity, you plug in your capex, your cap rate. You analyze multifamily deals like you analyze a business.
Sorry,
Yeah.
But where you guys come in, I wouldn't know how much to offer
Right.
a potential investor. That's where you guys would come in and say, hey, Mark,
Yeah.
you know what? Gosh, you said 6% to the potential investor. We would recommend 4%.
What I would say is it goes back to your buy box, right? It goes back to what are you trying to achieve? If your goal is I'm going to give my investors a 20% return, IRR, then if you're going to offer an 11% pref and your cash on cash is really low, you may not get to a 20%. So you can change certain levers to figure out what your returns are going to be within the financial model.
But you guys would look at all of those numbers of the deal to help.
For sure, yeah. And we have models as well that we use. You want to say something, Vince?
Yeah. So what we do is I have a financial model for Tri-City, and it's 70-30, 8 pref, plain vanilla returns, and I run all of our deals through that filter first. So I begin with the investor returns first. So I'll plug in a deal at whatever asking price, whatever loan terms I think I can get, and if the Class A shares, the 70-30 8 pref, is not at what a return I think that investors will be enticed by, then I start moving those levers. I'll start bringing that price down, right? I'll start putting more down payment or something like that, or higher level, whatever it is. I start moving the levers until I can get a return profile for the investors that I think they'll get excited about. The caution with that is you're sitting behind a computer screen on Excel, and it's real easy to make yourself look like a genius by clicking a couple buttons. So that's where your coach or your repetitions in doing underwriting is really going to come in, so you don't fool yourself into thinking that you found a good deal. So I have a plain template of a deal profile, put the deal in, and if I'm not within like a couple points of a good deal, like we'll say 14 IRR, if I'm not like a 9, there's not enough levers I can pull to get that up to a 17. like unless the price just plummets, right? So I got to be pretty close, like a couple points, and then I'll get into that financial engineering of like, hey, what if I tweak this here, tweak that there, and then have like a sanity check to make sure I'm not fooling myself, right? So that's where I start first, as far as like, am I offering enough or whatever? I don't find a deal and then I figure out how to sell this to investors and what type of returns I give them. I start with investor returns first, and then I get the deal to fit what return profile they need, and that gives me like concrete foundation when I go back to the broker is, look, this deal at that price is not going to give my investors the returns that they need to get into this deal. The price needs to be this, the terms need to be this. And then you're standing on solid foundation of sound judgment, and it's not doing what the brokers try to do, is get you emotional to figure out the price is 18 million, you figure it out how to pay 18 million. That is not the way to do it. It's you start with the returns that you're trying to get, and then that price needs to meet those returns, and it's usually down in order to hit those returns.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right. I think I have this slide in here because, talking about partnerships, this was just one of our deals. This was years ago, but this was a 65-35 split, and the sponsor member didn't qualify for financing, so we had to bring in two other partners. So this is how you would split up your GP, right? So his GP is 35%, and he had to bring in someone else with a higher net worth and more liquidity so that they could qualify for the loan. Well, he just carved them off 9% apiece, right? And so he's still at 82%, and it's well worth it, right? So you get the deal done in that way. And if there's any more questions, feel free to just, this is a very small group, so you guys can certainly ask. Again, how do we comply with securities regulations, and what are the regulations? So first we go through the Howey test, which we talked about a minute ago, right? You're investing money, you have a common enterprise. There's an expectation from investors of the share of the profits solely from the efforts of the promoter, that's you as the sponsor. If that investment contract exists, then you must register the offering with the SEC, or it falls under an exemption from registration. Okay? So all real estate syndications are considered investment contracts and are typically exempt from public offerings. And when we say exempt, this is a big distinction because, we're not talking about a public offering. Like we're not like an IPO, right? You probably heard of an IPO. An IPO is Tesla goes public, Uber goes public. Those are like fully baked offerings that go through the SEC first, and they have to approve it, underwrite it. There's bankers, and then the shares are created and they're offered to the public, right? That's a public offering. That's not the world we're in. We're in the private offering, right? And private offering means they're exempt. They're exempt from registration. Meaning the SEC is saying you don't have to register with us, right? But you just have to notify us that you have done this, right? So you have to file what's called a Form D with the SEC, and it's under Regulation D of the Securities Act. So we have this decision tree to kind of give you an idea, again, with the additional distinctions of joint venture versus syndication, but also how the company is managed gives you an indication of whether this is a syndication or not. So if it's member managed, right, that's joint venture world. All investors are taking an active role, and everyone has their defined responsibilities. They're investing. They don't have to necessarily invest the same amount, right, but they're investing together. And you're not in the SEC world. If it's manager managed, with which most syndications are, then you are in SEC compliance world. We got the public offerings we talked about here, and then Reg D. So we would flow this way. So we have two options under Regulation D to raise capital. First is 506B, right? And this is just the citation to the regulation. We call that the friends and family exemption. Okay, there's no limit on how much money you can raise through that exemption. And you can have a max 35 sophisticated investors. What's a sophisticated investor? Anyone who's not the definition is anyone who's not an accredited investor, right? But there needs to be some level of sophistication. Now, the SEC, I've never seen any cases that they test this, but I just give the example of like, your neighbor's a school teacher, her uncle died, left her $10 million, right? She's been teaching public school for 30 years. You can go knock on her door. Hey, I got a great deal. You want to invest in this deal? Right? She knows nothing about finance or investments or real estate. That may be, taking a little bit of liberties. I don't know if the SEC is going to come knocking on your door, but the idea is she needs to have some level of sophistication. Now, you can still educate her, right? Hey, read this offering memorandum. Let's meet for coffee. Let me show you how this works, right? You can still educate her, and she can make her own decision. Once she gets $10 million, she becomes an accredited investor anyway. But you know, you can have max 35. PPM, which we'll talk about in a minute, private placement memorandum is absolutely required, and there's no advertising. So these two things are the biggest issues. When you're deciding to raise capital and you're going to go after a deal, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do we need to advertise this offering? Do we have enough contacts in our personal sphere, our personal network, to take down this deal? If you do, I would say just do a 506B, right? Because you can have, you know, whether they're accredited or not, you can usually take down a deal with 35 sophisticated investors, and then you can sprinkle in some accredited investors, right? But you have to have a pre-existing substantive relationship. So this is where, remember we talked about raising capital from strangers? You can't do that in a 506B. In 506B, now everyone in this room, you guys already have a pre-existing substantive relationship just by being in this room, right? You get everyone's contact information, they all flow into your CRM, you follow up with an email later, you have contacts, right? So that's how you develop and show that you have a pre-existing substantive relationship with your investor contacts. So that's why it's very important to keep track of all those relationships. In a 506C, right, and this all came about after the Jobs Act of 2012. You know, the private equity community was like, look, social media is a big thing. We want to start advertising our offerings, our private offerings. How can we do that? And so the SEC said, okay, we'll let you advertise. But if you do that, it's going to be under this regulation, and you're not allowed to have any sophisticated investors. So that's the big rub, right? A, do you want to advertise or not? If yes, you have to go C. If you don't need to advertise, you can do B or C, but you have to know them prior to the offering in order to go for a 506B. Because the C, you don't need a pre-existing substantive relationship. So if you see these offerings on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, LinkedIn's a big marketplace for raising capital. Most, I would hope, all of those are 506C offerings, right? Because that's the only way you can do that on that platform. Do you have any questions about this? This is kind of the biggest decision to make.
I would say if you're not sure, 99% of us in this room are going to be 506B for a
Yep.
very long time.
Yep. Yeah.
Do you have to have a fund to do 506C?
Nope. No, you can do single asset syndications in a C.
And then also for the like what's the jump? You know, as far as the difficulty with structuring a deal or
Yeah, so
cost, whatever.
so the documentation is really kind of the same. I mean, in a C, the PPM maybe you could use an abbreviated PPM, because the idea is all these investors are accredited, and so they have a level of sophistication that they don't need the fully baked in risks and disclosures that you would typically put in a B, right? Oh, this is the other thing, I didn't mention this. In a B, if you do have accredited investors, they can self-certify. So part of our documentation is we give them an investor questionnaire, and they just check a box and say, yep, I'm accredited. In a C, you have to verify their accreditation. So you can either do that by having the awkward conversation like, hey, give me your tax return, right? you need to look, and I'll tell you what the accredited means, but you need to look at their net worth, how much money they make, right? What's their salary? And so most people, they'll use like an investment platform, like Cashflow Portal, InvestNext, AppFolio, Juniper Square, all these platforms, and that platform will have an accreditation software built in. So they'll ask the question, right? It's just a little awkward, I think, to ask somebody like, and I've done it before. I mean, I've had to do it, and I've been the person to certify someone else that they're accredited if needed. You can usually get a letter from their lawyer or their CPA, or you just have to look at their financial information to
So why do I hear it's harder?
A C?
Or why not? Like, if you're really good at marketing and advertising, which is probably why you see it a lot
Yeah.
on LinkedIn, which is going crazy right now, like, I'm just trying to...
It's not harder. The documentation is pretty much the same.
Okay.
It's just maybe the accreditation, having to verify the accreditation of the investors, but it's really not.
I think it's harder. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's harder because people's networks or their marketing skills aren't as good as they
Yeah.
think they are. And they're like, oh, if I just do a 506C
I'll get capital.
Start
Right.
flowing in, and it really doesn't work like that.
Yeah, so can I make this point?
Yeah.
I wanna follow up, Vince's exact point. So we had a deal about 3 years ago, and a common, partner, knew 2 people, my main business partner and myself, and he knew 3 other guys. He was working with them to try to get a deal. He brought us together to do a deal. One of the 3 in that, partnership group, if you will, wanted to do a 506C to put it on his resume because he had never done it before, although he'd been in other syndications, right? We, being the nice guys we are, agreed to it. Darren's track record is built off of people in this room that I know, that I do life with, that text me on a regular basis, when's your next deal? What's going on? Always done a 506B. And the C, I thought, oh, no problem. My same buddies reach out to me that want to reinvest, that have been in other deals 2 or 3 times previously. Are you accredited? No. I cut out.
Yeah.
So the marketing is not as good as you think it is, and you think just because you don't have to know them and it's a 506C and you do all the marketing, you think it's going to be easy. And to his point, he already said 99% of the time it's going to be a 506B.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'll never do another 506C, but that's the only one I've done to date, and we got it done, no problem. But I was frustrated because I couldn't bring along.
Yeah, because they have to be accredited. Yeah.
I'll do two more points, and sorry, I'll yield back. The jump off point, you said when. The when for us was when you start exhausting your 506B. These are people that you have substantial relationships with, and after 3, 4 deals, that circle is going to start getting exhausted. So that's why you got to, go to more networking. Well, you know this, you're a great networker, so you got to meet more people because you got to get that 506B. But still, in your 506B, you're going to hit that 35 cap for the sophisticated or not accredited, right? And then, so that was a jump off point for us. And then there's I don't know what the official term is, the conversion. Like you could do a B.
You can convert from a B to a
and
C.
then
Yeah.
So we've done this several times where you do the B, you max out the 35 seats, and then you want to like hit that last little bit of the raise, you convert it to, you spend extra money, do the C, and then now you can start posting online and try to get that last little bit of raise. So we've done that a couple times, and it pulled in a little bit more, but still.
Right. And to your point about, that's why nurturing investor relationships is so important, right? Nurturing them, even online, through social media, through newsletters, and in-person conversations, right? You have to nurture the relationships because you can't just post it online and think you're going to get a bunch of capital. And I want to go back here real quick to this one. So the other reason why you want to partner with people is say we're doing a deal here, and it's $1 million raise. Well, he can only raise $250,000. What is he going to do? And he doesn't want to go to a C because he doesn't want to bring in. He doesn't know accredited investors. How's he going to fill the other $750,000? Well, he knows this guy. This guy can bring in another $500,000 because he's got friends and family that can bring in $500,000, right? But his investors, this guy doesn't know his investors, right? So if this guy reached out to his investors and they did not have the pre-existing substantive relationship, he couldn't take that money, right? And this guy maybe has the other $250,000, right? So now, as long as and that's why you bring in these capital raisers or these other partners that do have the capital connections and relationships into the GP, so that you comply with the pre-existing substantive relationship rule, right? So it's another way to get deals done through larger, just through partnerships. Yeah, so that's another important point. Okay, so we talked about pre-existing substantive relationship. You're allowed to advertise in a C. To convert, you have to kind of delineate. You have to have like this cooling off period where like you're going to stop raising capital on October 1st, stop a B, and then you start a C like 2 weeks later, right? And then because all the B investors still get to come in, but you can't take any more unaccredited investors.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you talked about the max 35, and Vince mentioned it as well, is that an accumulation of deals? Or is that, in other words, does the SEC, do they keep track of how many, in other words, is it 33? I have 5 deals and I'm at 33 investors thus far. Is it per deal? Or
Per deal.
Or is it an accumulation of?
No, it's per deal.
Per deal.
Per deal. Yep.
Okay.
35 per deal. So if you have 5 active deals going on at once, you've got 35 times 5. But it has to be 35 per individual deal. Yeah.
This might be a question
Right, right.
And
Well,
then you can bring more in with a C. Why have a fund? Is it because of the deal?
yeah, so people, lots of reasons. I mean, first, it's hard to start a fund unless you have the track record, number one, right? Because a fund, it really, there's two types of fund, right? Blind pool funds, where it's a discretionary fund. Money is given to the sponsors, and they can go invest it in whatever they want, right? You have, right, then you have specific either fund of funds or targeted funds where we're going to go out and buy Class B multifamily properties in the Southeast, right? And the reason why you have a fund is so you have the discretionary capital at the ready, and you're not having to raise it individually for each individual deal.
Okay.
That's
So
the
then
biggest.
You can spread it out into multiple deals.
Yeah, but typically most funds are 506C,
Right.
right? Because it'd be hard if you're raising a $10 million fund or a $20 million fund, and you can only have 3,500 accredited investors. So most funds are C. They don't have to be, but they usually are.
So, you asked,
Very good.
no, you're good here. So you asked, 35's a lot. This is where that balancing, when you start setting it up. So 35's a lot if you're doing $5 million deals. If you're doing $30 million deals and you have 35 people, each person needs to put in, 200,000, 250,000, 400,000, and you kind of see where that's not gonna work. So either you convert to the 506C and get more accredited investors, you have unlimited accredited investors, or you start raising your minimums. The normal is like 50K, and that's why you see people say, hey, we're at 75K, now we're at 100K, because with the 35 seats, they're not able to
Right.
make the raise anymore because their deals are getting too big. So these are these growth things, these obstacles that you don't know are in front of you, but in two years from now, you're like, oh, that's why I need to raise my minimum to 100K because I have a $10 million raise and I can't do that with 35 people.
Yep.
Right?
Okay.
So,
Yeah, good point. So what is an accredited investor? There was some talk recently in Congress of changing this. They actually have not done that yet. But an accredited investor for an individual, someone who's making 200K or more as an individual, or 300K or more if they're married and filed jointly, or if they have a net worth of $1 million or more, excluding their primary residence, right? Excluding the equity in their primary residence. If that's what you look for when you verify this accreditation status. That's why W-2 statements, tax returns, brokerage account statements, things like that will verify this kind of information. An entity, you have to have a net worth of at least $5 million. Most investors are individual, right? Even if it's a single member LLC, it's a pass-through entity to their individual sole member. Then everyone else is non-accredited. So we talked about what is pre-existing substantive relationship. This always comes up. Well, how well do I need to know them, right? How many times do I need to meet with them? And there's no real guidance, I mean, the SEC is not going to give us the playbook because the enforcement officers want to keep their jobs, right? But typically we advise that it must exist prior to the commencement of the offering, right? And there's no set minimum. I mean, if you meet somebody in here and you don't get their number and you didn't make a connection with them, and then you want to raise capital from them later, but you never met them out of just seeing this room, I'd say that's probably not pre-existing. Or it would be pre-existing, but it's not substantive, right? It's not substantive. And this is an issue too. So if someone had a deal like right now, they're getting ready to publish, and they meet you today, and they want to offer it to you tomorrow, it could be a little dicey because there's not enough time between establishing the relationship and when the offer is made, so that it's not considered general advertising and soliciting under 506C, right? We used to say, it's been a while, but kind of like a 3-touch rule is what I would say. Like you met them, you emailed them, had a phone call with them, right? If you had 3 points of contact with them, I would say usually that would qualify for a pre-existing substantive relationship. There's been, this is old news now 2020, but these are other accredited investors, knowledgeable employees at funds and people who hold specific licenses would be considered accredited. Family offices with at least $5 million, of course, those are going to be accredited. Most people at this stage are not really dealing with these types of individuals. We talked about this a minute ago, right? Not the neighbor down the street. They have to have sufficient knowledge and experience in financial and business matters. Because you think the SEC was created to protect investors, right? This is the the Regulation D of the Securities Act of 1933, right? This was made right after the financial crash, the Great Depression, and it was to protect investors. So they want to make sure people are not getting taken advantage of, especially these days when you've got Ponzi schemes. And I don't know if you guys read the news about, maybe it was 2 years ago, all those, I forgot the name of the guy, but big syndicator in Houston that lost, what, $600 million of deals.
He like fled the country, didn't he?
Yeah, it's in India. Yeah. So I think it got a bad rap because everyone, when debt was 3%, you would make money just from putting the deal into contract and closing. You'd make $1 million just on the appreciation, right? So everyone was making money and they're buying variable rate debt. So that 3%, when we started having COVID and problems, that 3% went to 11%, right? And you couldn't make your debt payment. I mean, there's a deal I'm looking at right now in Atlanta. It was last sold for $150,000 a door. The guy's like, just give me 100. It's like from 15 million to 10 million. Just get me out of this mess. All right, so we talked about the PPM. What is the PPM? It stands for Private Placement Memorandum, fancy term for a big disclosure document. I'm gonna trademark the term PPM CYA because it covers your ass in case something goes wrong, right? But these are all the things that are in the PPM. All these very important topics, right? Sources and uses. What are the distributions and fees? Obviously, identification of the property, voting rights, liquidity. How are you going to handle disputes? What's the business plan, right? How are you going to make money, right? What's your plan? Are you going to increase rents? Are you going to add value? Are you going to decrease expenses? How are you going to make money? What are the risks? This property's in a bad part of the city, or construction costs may go up, or there could be tariffs, or there could be inflation. All these things have to be disclosed to your investors, because if you lose your money, you're going to go back to this document and say, look, I told you, right? And that this could possibly happen. There's conflicts of interest, right? You're getting a fee, you're getting an acquisition fee. Or are you buying this property because you're making $100,000 at closing, or are you buying this property because it's a good deal for your investors, right? So those conflicts have to be disclosed and waived essentially by the investor by giving them this particular document. And then how do sponsors make money, right? Everyone's doing this for financial freedom and to earn money and to make sure that they have enough. So how do we get paid? So typically there's 5 ways investors get paid. This is 4, but there's another one. Acquisition fees, typically 2 to 3% of the deal, right? So $10 million deal, $300,000 acquisition fee. That's a good day. Buy one of those every quarter, you'd be in good shape, right? That sounds like the dream. And you got to bring in two other partners, share that fee a little bit if you have to. Asset management fees, typically 1 to 2%. What that fee is for is basically managing the property manager, managing the manager, right? Because the investors are going to expect reports. They may want to visit the property. They're going to inspect. They're going to expect communication. I can't tell you how many times clients will get in trouble just for not communicating with their investors, right? Over communicate. Give them pictures. Tell them when you're at the property. Show them the renovations. Show them the budget. If you get a monthly report from your property manager, share it with the investors, right? You want to be over-inclusive, because the biggest risk and problem that investors get into with the SEC is misrepresentation, right? The offering memorandum says this, but you did something different over here, or just flat out not responding to them. If you don't respond to them, they're going to go call someone else who's going to look into it. Refinance fees are pretty typical, and then disposition fees. I don't really like to charge these. I don't know, Vince, do you charge these on yours? No. Yeah, it's a little rich. I feel like, some investors are like, it's kind of fee heavy, right? But people do it. People do it, and investors are fine with it. And then obviously the depreciation, which is not a part of this presentation, but the depreciation and doing the cost segregation study, that's another huge way that investors and sponsors alike are going to earn income. And then obviously distribution of the cash flow, right? Share of the cash flow, sale proceeds, anywhere from 30 to 50%. So you're ready to make an offer, right? You found a deal, you got it under LOI, you got it under contract even. What are you going to do next? What's your next step, right? Tactical advice. You're going to create an offering memorandum. That's separate from your PPM. That's separate from your operating agreements and your corporate documents. The offering memorandum is your pitch to your investors, right? So that's going to, 10, 12 pages, usually PowerPoint, Canva, and it's going to be who you are, what's your track record, if any, what's the deal, what's the business plan, what are the returns. I always throw a tax slide in there. What are the tax advantages, and then what are the next steps? How do you invest, right? That's the document you're going to share with your investors to show them exactly what you're asking. And then once that is created, the business plan is created, then we create the operating agreement. That's where your lawyer comes in. We typically will do that. We create the subscription agreement. We create the PPM, right? And then you're ready to make an offer. But then what's your plan? Part of being here and being a part of groups like this is to build that investor database. I hope every one of you in here invest in each other's deals, right? I always say that because this is your first swath of investors is going to come from groups like this. So it's very important that you do that. Attend these meetups, invest in other deals, build your team. We talked about on the GP team, right? You have an underwriter, asset manager. Who's your investor relations? Your attorney, right? Have a solid attorney. Your broker. Develop relationships with the brokers. I cannot explain enough to you guys how important it is because that's where the deals are going to come from. In the commercial market, multifamily market in particular, the brokers are the key, right? Having relationships with brokers. Now, brokers will have on-market deals, but they have off-market deals. They have what's called pocket listings. Right? That means they've talked to I was at a property yesterday and it was like, well, the guy next door, he'll sell, if you bring him an offer. Right? It's not on the market, it's not on LoopNet or Crexi or even on like a broker's website. It's just like, yeah, he's older, bring him an offer, he'll sell. Right? Those are called pocket listings. Those are the ones you really want to find because as soon as they're online, they're going to be picked over, everyone's going to be looking at it. That's where you can find the real opportunities. And then I would develop a solid relationship with a lender, if nothing but for the ease of transaction, because once your lender has all your information, it's just easy to keep doing deals one after another. This was one of our deals a while ago, but I just wanted to give this as a snapshot. This was part of our offering memorandum, right? And again, you're still selling the deal to the investors, but this was the piece I wanted to really show. Kind of the timeline, right? PS, because once you're under contract, it's go time, right? You are on the clock to close. So every day matters, right? You got to get your inspections done quickly. You got to get your financing executed quickly. You got to go through due diligence. Your PPM is issued, right? And then you have your investor portal. Give a commitment date to your LPs, right? Get your commitments in by X date, right? Now, when they commit, that's different from actually wiring in the money. The commitment is, okay, they've signed the subscription agreement, they've signed up in the investor portal, they're committed, right? You're counting on them. Because you don't want to, an investor's not going to give you $100,000 and let it sit in your account for 2 months, right? They may lose out on some high yield interest in some other account. So typically, we have a firm commitment, then they're going to sign the subscription agreement, then we're going to say, okay, you need to submit it about a week before closing. Go ahead and get it in the account. Because your lender is not going to fund their loan until all of your equity is in. That's just how lenders operate, right? They want to make sure you got your skin in the game first before they're sending in their wire. And then I've got a couple vignettes. I don't know, Vince, we can go through these. And then I think this is the last little bit, but let's see what you guys think about this. So Tom, Becca, and Mark, they each have $200K. They want to invest in a multifamily deal. They've submitted offers on multiple properties during the last 6 months. They've underwritten the deals together, ultimately decided as a group whether to submit an offer or not. They determine unanimously that if one of their offers gets accepted, they're going to pool their $200K together, purchase the property, and operate it as a team. Alas, they have an offer accepted. Now they've gotten it under contract. They want to know what's the best way to structure it. How should they invest their $600K? Is this a joint venture or a syndication? Everyone's not sure. Yeah, it's a joint venture, right? It's a joint venture.
You're not going outside.
Well, yeah, they're making decisions as a group. That's their first key, right? Right? They're going to pool their money together, and it's all going to go in one deal. But the real thing is here. They're making decisions as a group, right? All right, same Tom, Becca, and Mark. They still have 200K apiece. You know, they want to invest in multifamily. They underwrite deals together, ultimately decide as a group they want to submit an offer or not. They determine unanimously that if one of their offers is accepted, they're going to pool the 600K together, purchase the property. They have an offer accepted, and they got in their targeted contract. However, they need $800,000 to close the transaction, and they only have $600 between them. Becca, however, has a friend, George, who wants to invest in the deal because he heard from Rod Cleave how real estate investment can lead to financial freedom. I used to give this presentation at Rod's events all the time. So George has 3 kids and no free time to help to operate the property. Take my money, but I can't operate. I don't have the time to do it. Right? What do they do here? How should they invest their own 600K? What if George wants to invest via 1031? This one's tricky.
Gotta do a tick.
Got to do a tick.
And at the top, you split the ownership on the title.
Yep.
And there's no pref. It's essentially a top line JV.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, this is a little bit, gets a little bit deeper, but to do it as a 1031, it's a conversation for another day probably because it's complicated. But it can be done, but it's not really a syndication. It's not a syndication. It's essentially a joint venture. A couple more of these. So here, they still have the 600K, but based on the purchase price, they're going to need $1 million. They're going to need to bring in other people for additional capital. And they prefer the persons invest directly in the deal. So what should they do? So they don't have 600K. They need $1 million. So they need to get another 400K, and they're gonna offer it to investors. What is this? Joint venture or syndication? Syndication. Now, what if all of these other investors that they found, no one knows them personally? What exemption should they use? C, exactly. What if these other investors were contacts of George who said, I'll invest too, right? How should they handle that? And George has $400,000 of contacts.
Bring George in as a co-GP.
Yep, bring George in as a co-GP. Remember that slide earlier? That satisfies the pre-existing substantive relationship rule. George is in. He can still be passive in the GP. He's like, well, I don't want a part of it, but he's still a part of the management structure, right? So it's still fine if George is, hands off, but he's still in the GP. He's in the managing entity, and then all of George's investors are now in the deal. Does that make sense?
What if George's only role was raising capital in the GP? Then what?
That's okay.
That's okay.
That's a role, yeah. As long as he's in the management structure, he's in the actual GP entity, and there are his contacts, his role can be to raise capital. Because you can't, see, people will try to pay consulting fees, all these other fees for capital raisers. You cannot do that unless you have a broker-dealer, right? You have a broker-dealer license, and you're regulated by FINRA. That's the only way you can actually pay a fee to someone for raise capital. So if someone says, I'll raise you $1 million, but you owe me, give me $200,000, you can't do that, right? That violates FINRA.
Yeah, or distinction.
Yeah. But so the workaround is to bring them into the GP, yeah.
So then, if someone were to be brought into the deal just to raise capital, could they not technically take a portion of the acquisition fee?
Yeah.
And they're technically getting paid, so wouldn't that be broker-dealer activity or no?
Well, so you can't have an in-kind type of. Another thing you can't do is say, I'll bring in the capital raiser and I'll give you, 3% of the GP for every $100,000 you raise. People do that all the time. You can't do that. It has to be, and I know people do that anyway. At least don't put it on paper, okay? At least have conversations outside where you're kind of developing your GP team and your percentages. It's always a fluid conversation, and it's true. Like if you're trying to raise capital for a deal and you're counting on one guy and he failed to bring in the other $1 million, the other GP team had to bring in the rest. Well, it's going to be adjusted, his GP stake, right? Was that a question?
Good protection
Oh,
for that,
yeah.
A good protection for that is never have somebody like that's their only role.
Yeah.
It's they do this and this, an active thing. Like they do, everybody has capital raising, and they do project management, and they do investor relations, and they do whatever. So just
Yeah.
So that's how I do it. It's like nobody on our team
Just does capital raise. Yeah, because I mean, you can still have that as a responsibility as long as they're in the management structure, but you know, have it identified where everyone's kind of doing everything. It's a good idea. So here's a couple more. So Tom, Becca, and Mark, they meet Omar, who Omar has access to the capital. He's already invested in numerous other deals, and he joins their team as a partner before the offer is accepted. Right? So he joins before the offer is accepted. Now they need $4 million of capital. Omar is going to help them raise the additional capital. You know, they're not exactly sure what it means to have other raised capital for them, and would like to learn more about the implications and how to comply with the law, since they're fairly certain it's not allowed except under limited circumstances. So what do we do with Omar? We just talked about this. We give him a piece of the GP. He comes in. He has an active role in the management of the company, and he can help raise the capital that way, right? That's how you get around the broker-dealer issues. Same scenario, but they meet Omar after the offer is accepted, right? So after the offer is accepted, what do we do in this instance? You know, and Omar said that he wants $5,000 for each investor he brings in. What do we tell Omar? Can't do that. Can't do that, buddy. You know, the SEC will not allow this quid pro quo, in-kind type of relationship. You know. So sorry, Omar. Last one. So same facts. Tom, Beck, and Mark. They got and then Omar wants to come in and join the team after the offer is accepted for the purposes of raising capital, right? Based on the purchase price, they're going to need a total of $4 million. They're going to partner with Omar, who's going to help them raise the additional capital needed to close the transaction. He joined their partnership after the contract was accepted. So what do you think about that? If this is a 506C, then I think we're okay. We're okay. You can bring in Omar, you know, as a capital raiser into the deal, and you're going to be just fine. But see, these you're going to run into these situations all the time as you're putting together partnerships to take down these real estate assets. You've got to figure out how to navigate these partnerships and make sure that you do it with people that. Oh, here's B or C. I think you guys know the big difference between B and C. You think so? All right, we'll fly through these. I don't think we need to go through these. All right, that's it, guys. About an hour.
Thanks.
Yeah. You're welcome. Any questions? Yeah, take a photo of my contact info if you need it.